There are a few common rules that you need to know when using Telerik UI for ASP.NET MVC. Let's call these fundamentals. These are high-level concepts that are shared among all the components and general library-specific workflows as well. So in this chapter, we'll talk about component naming, script and style placement, optimizations like bundling, and using only client-side assets that you need. And we'll be building on a real usage scenario while applying those concepts.
Let's open up our RPS Tracker ASP MVC. This is our work in progress project, the one that doesn't have Kendo implemented yet. However, we have added the Kendo NuGet package, so make sure you already have that in the solution. Now, since we've added the reference to the server-side bits of the Telerik UI library, we'll immediately be able to start using the HTML helpers that come with the library in our Razor pages. Let's jump right into an example. But just a bit of warning first, this will not give us the expected result until we add client libraries a little bit later. So let's add the server-side helper for a button, and then we'll be back later to add the client-side libraries to make everything work. Open up your rps.web project, and then open up views, and then the dashboard folder. Here you'll find the index.cs HTML file. Let's open that up. And if you scroll down just a little bit, you'll find a button group. This is styled with Bootstrap, by the way. And we have 3 HTML buttons in here. We want to convert these to Kendo buttons. So the way you access any Kendo UI helpers is by using the standard HTML helper syntax. So we're inside the Razor view right now. You would add the @ and then HTML and then dot. So here you'll get a list of all the available helpers that are currently registered in the project. And you'll notice one of them is Kendo. This is the one we're going to need. Now the reason this shows up here is because we've registered this in the web config. So this is a function. We're going to call it. And then we're going to use a Fluent API to be able to tack on and access different widgets and different attributes for each widget. So here in the project on the dashboard page, we have this set of buttons right here at the top. These filter the data that's shown by 3 months, 6 months, and 1 year. And notice the URL is also being updated. That's important because we're going to need to take care of that as well. So for 3 months, there's months equals 3 in the URL. For 6 months, months equals 6. And for 1 year, months equals 12. All right, let's head back to the solution. And what we need is a button. So I'm going to access the button. By the way, notice all the different UI widgets that are available here. We'll get into that a little bit later. So we're going to call the button. And on the button, we're able to add all sorts of different attributes. We'll come back to that. Now, what would happen if I were to just save this file and run this code? I don't need to rerun this because this is compiled on the fly. There's no need for an extra server-side compilation step. So I can just keep my solution running while I'm editing any of the CS HTML files. And let's take a look. I'm going to just need to refresh this page to see what happens. So this is one of the very important things I wanted to mention regarding Kendo UI widgets. Each widget needs a unique ID on the page. So these can be accessible via front-end client script. So in order to give it a unique ID, we actually need to provide the name property. So let's do that. I'm going to hit continue here. It's going to give me an error on the page, and that's okay. Let's go back to the code. So I need to specify the name here. I'm going to call this button filter months 3, just so that it's pretty clear what this filter button does. Okay, and once I give it a name and save this file, I'm going to reload the page, and you'll see that we no longer get an error. In fact, we do have a little button right there. So remember when I said the button have to be unique? There is no way to enforce that, unfortunately, because just like in HTML, you can have multiple elements on the page with the same ID. So if I create another button here with the same name, there's nothing to stop me from doing that. And there are 2 buttons with the same ID. I'm going to open up developer tools here and let's check it out real quick. There we go. Here's our button being rendered by Kendo UI. and it has an ID of button filter months 3. And there's our second button with the same exact ID. If you do that, your Kendo UI libraries won't work. So it's up to you to ensure that you name your widgets with different names. That way they're rendered with different IDs in HTML. So the second one I'm going to name months 6, and we'll come back to that one. Let's finish up the button example in the next lesson. Every Kendo UI widget comes with the server-side code. That's what we see here. This is something you have to implement yourself. And then it automatically includes client-side code. We haven't included the client-side libraries yet, but the client-side code is still generated. So in our example, where we included 2 Kendo buttons here, let's take a look at how the client-side code is rendered. All right, there's our app. And here we have 2 Kendo buttons right next to each other. They don't have any text yet, but we'll fix that in a moment. In fact, let's do that right now. I'm going to add the content here. It's not named text for a specific reason. We could give this button just a string and call it 3 months. And that's just like this button right here. So it's going to have the content of the button being 3 months. But we're not limited to text in our content. So we could actually give this some HTML. Let's say I could define a span in here with 6 months. And I could do something like that. But I don't need any HTML in here. I just need the text 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. But let's get back to the topic at hand here, which is script generation. I'm going to refresh this page. And here we have the 2 buttons. Don't get this confused with the other HTML buttons here. The first 2 are Kendo buttons. So here they are in the code, button and another button. And notice something else. Right after the button, we have script tags. In fact, after every Kendo widget, you're going to have a script tag that's going to have some kind of function it executes related to that client-side operation of the button. Notice here that we're actually calling jQuery the ID of the button. That's why these have to be unique. And then we're instantiating a Kendo button on the client side with an object, which is the options. If you're interested in learning more about jQuery and how Kendo UI works with jQuery, there's a course in this library. But in this course, we're not talking about client side. You'll just have this automatically generated for you. So we are dependent on jQuery to be present. And in the Microsoft template that we've used, jQuery is already present. So we don't need to worry about that. However, if you're starting from scratch completely and you don't have jQuery included, you have to include jQuery. We'll get into that in a little bit. All right, so we have these scripts generated right after each button. However, sometimes that's not preferable. Sometimes you want to keep all your scripts in one place. Well, there's a way to do that with Kendo UI. Let's go back to the project. And in this Fluent API, we have the option to call deferred. I'm going to call deferred on the first one, but not the second one. And let's save this file and take a look. So here's our first button. Notice there is no script tag there anymore. And after the second button, there's still a script tag. So where's the script for the first button? Well, it's actually nowhere. It's not being rendered at all right now because we didn't specify where we wanted it to be rendered. If you're using deferred with your UI widgets, you need to explicitly tell your Razor pages where you want those deferred scripts to be rendered. And there is another HTML helper provided to you by the Kendo library. So typically you would have your scripts either somewhere at the bottom of the page before the closing body tag or up in the head. Just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to go to the bottom of this index Razor page and I'm going to use my Kendo HTML helper and I'm going to call the deferred scripts on this. So when I call this function, this is where all the deferred scripts are going to be rendered. And in my case, somewhere after the closing div of this Razor page, which is still not at the bottom of the page or anywhere really. It's not really helping me to have it here. Let's say I wanted this to be at the bottom of the page. Well, you need to open up your shared and then layout in order to find out where we're going to be rendering the scripts section. So let me close out all this HTML with a navigation. And here at the very bottom, right before the closing body tag, we're rendering the scripts section. So if I want my Kendo scripts to be placed there, then I need to wrap this call in a section call. So at section scripts, and then I'm going to place my Kendo helper inside there. Let's take a look. I'm going to refresh and I'm going to head down to the bottom. And as you can see, right before the closing body tag, there's that script. That's the same one for the button filter months 3. Now, you're not limited to putting your scripts down at the bottom. That's entirely up to you. In fact, we'll talk about this in a bit. But here's an example of how you can control where your Kendo related scripts are rendered. Now you might have noticed a couple of things here after we've added our buttons. One is that these buttons are just regular HTML buttons and they don't have any special styling from Kendo buttons. And you also might notice that we have this little error here. Let's take a look at that. Well, it says uncaught reference error, Kendo is not defined. Well, that's not surprising because we didn't actually add any Kendo client-side libraries yet. We need to add the Kendo CSS so that we get the styling for the buttons and all the widgets. And we also need to add the Kendo related JavaScript files so that the buttons and other widgets function the way they should. Let's start with adding the JavaScript. I'm going to head over here to our project and let's open up layout.cshtml. Now you might know that if I generate my web project based on the ASP.NET MVC template that comes with Visual Studio, it's automatically going to include the Bootstrap and the jQuery, the libraries and the scripts, and the CSS and JavaScript from Bootstrap as well. Now these are rendered as bundles, which means they're being compiled, minified, and bundled into one file. If I open up app start, we have this bundle config here. This is where the magic happens. This is the bundler that comes with the MVC template. We're going to utilize this for Kendo as well, but first I want to add the Kendo libraries without bundling. Notice here that we have style bundles and script bundles. I also have my custom bundles here as well. This has my CSS for the dashboard page, the backlog page, and the details page in separate bundles, and I reference these bundles on those pages. All right, so let's open up layout.cshtml. We're rendering the jQuery dependency and the Bootstrap library at the bottom of the page, right before the closing body tag. So if you know that you're going to be using Kendo UI throughout your application, the layout view will be a good place to put your Kendo libraries. Let's go ahead and add them here. Right after Bootstrap, I want to add my Kendo libraries. And when I installed the NuGet package, they were added to scripts, Kendo, then this is the release. And you can see that there's quite a few things in here. It might be a little confusing at first what we need to add. Now, if you're using just a button, for example, you don't need to add everything. I'll show you what we need to add if we're just going to be using a button in a bit. But for now, let's add everything just so that we don't have to worry about it. And the library that contains everything that we need is this Kendo all.min.js. You can imagine this is a pretty big library, pretty big file. I'm just going to drag this over here and it's automatically going to create a script tag for me pointing to that file. All right, but that's not all. If we're going to be using the scheduler component, we're not going to be doing that in this course. But if you do need that, there's another script you need to add next. That's this one right here. Kendo timezones.min.js, and that needs to come after Kendo all.min.js. And finally, we need to add one last bit, and that's for ASP.NET MVC. So that's kendo.aspnetmvc.min.js, and that needs to come last. So these are the three Kendo JavaScript libraries we need to add after the jQuery dependency. But this needs to also come before our Kendo scripts are rendered. So if you're not using deferred, placing all these top level libraries at the bottom of the page is not going to work. So the recommended approach for Kendo UI is actually to place all these libraries in the head of the document. So I'm going to copy all these, including the jQuery and Bootstrap, because the Kendo libraries depend on jQuery, so jQuery needs to be on the page first. I'm going to cut these from here, and I'm going to go up to the head of the document. And right after we render styles, I'm going to go ahead and paste in what I cut. So now in the head of the document, we have jQuery, Bootstrap, and the Kendo libraries, and then our render scripts section. I'm going to reserve the scripts sections for any custom page-specific JavaScript that I need to add later. But my Kendo deferred scripts, I want to control exactly where that goes. So I'm going to go to index, and right here where we added the Kendo deferred scripts in the last lesson, I'm going to remove that from here. Let's cut that. And I'm actually going to place it right here after my last dependency for Kendo. So it's going to go right there, but before my custom scripts. So first I render the Kendo libraries. In fact, I'm going to remove this time zone one. I'm just going to comment that out because I'm not going to be using the scheduler. So that's less stuff for me to load. So we're loading Kendo all, ASP MVC, and then deferred scripts. These are all the Kendo related widget scripts that are going to be here. And then we're going to render our script section with our custom page related scripts. We don't have any of those just yet. Now that we have these scripts added, let's go back to the page. And you'll see this error right here is still there. I'm going to refresh the page. And now there is no more error because we now have defined all the scripts that are required by these widgets. And now we're able to use either deferred scripts or scripts that are placed in line right after each widget because we've defined all the Kendo dependencies up in the head of the document. Our Kendo buttons still don't look like much. They look like just regular HTML buttons. And that's because we're still missing a key element of the Kendo library, and that's styling. Let's go back to our code and let's open up Solution Explorer. Now we have this scripts file where we pulled the Kendo scripts from. There's also the content folder. This is where the Telerik NuGet package deployed the Kendo styles. So in the content folder, we have a Kendo folder. Here we also have the release folder, not the source, but the final release right here. And we have a ton to pick from here. We'll be talking a little bit more about all these different files later on in the course. But for now, let's use the Kendo default theme. And that's this one right here, default version 2. So this is just a CSS file. I have my layout view open right here. I'm going to go ahead and drag this out. In fact, first I'm going to make some space. So right after the content CSS bundle is rendered right here, and before the modernizer script, I'm going to add our Kendo default min CSS file right here. So when I drag this out, it creates a link with the reference pointing to that CSS file. I'm going to save this and let's take a look. All right, there we go. As soon as I brought in the CSS, you can see that now these two buttons look significantly different. Now these are Kendo buttons, they have the Kendo theme applied, and they also behave like Kendo buttons. So what does the application of this style sheet really give us? Well, it gives us quite a bit. Let's go back to the code and open up our index.cshtml file for the dashboard. Let's go back to where we have these buttons defined. We now have the ability to add certain looks to these buttons. Since these specific buttons refer to filters based on dates, I want to add a little icon here. And because I've added the CSS now from Kendo library, I can do that. Our Fluent API for buttons has an icon function, and we can provide just the name of the icon we want to use. I happen to know that the one I want to use is called calendar. We're going to get more into icons later on in the course, but for now I just wanted to add one real quick. And if we take a look now, you'll see it's as easy as that to add an icon to our button. You can also add images and different styling attributes to the buttons. Part of the Fluent API also allows you to tack on HTML attributes, which is what we're going to do now. I want you to notice something else here. This line is getting pretty long. And notice how I used @HTML. If I want to split this up to a second line, I wouldn't be able to do that. I'll just get an error. Or let's say I wanted to split this up even earlier, right over here. This will result in an error. The way to avoid the error and still have the ability to have multiple lines so it's more legible is by using the parentheses right after the @ symbol, and then we can close the parentheses when we're done defining our Kendo widget. We're going to be using this technique throughout the course, so it's very important to learn that. All right, let's add on some HTML attributes, and I want to add a Kendo class here. So I need to provide a new object, and I can't just write class here because that's a keyword. I need to write @class, and to this button I want to add the primary class, and that's kPrimary. You can now add Kendo UI related classes directly to buttons, and when we apply a theme, the new theme is automatically going to restyle all the elements that are using Kendo classes. So if we take a look at this primary button, you'll see that it has this orange glow, which is a sign that we're using the Kendo default theme. We're going to be changing the theme later on in the course. So I do want to use the HTML attributes and the class, but I don't want to use the kPrimary class here. I want to use a different class, and that's kStateActive. This will tell me that this particular filter button is active, but I want to do this conditionally. So let's go back here to our folders, and in the dashboard controller, in the index action, I set the months property on the view bag to be the number of months that we've requested. So every time the months button is pressed, the viewbag.months property will have that number. So I want to have this button be active whenever the months equals 6. So here I'm going to set the class, and I'm going to check the viewbag property and the months property in there. If it equals 6, then we're going to set the kStateActive class. Otherwise, I just won't set a class at all. All right, so now months equals 12. None of these buttons are active. If I tap on 6 over here, you'll see that the styling is a little bit different here. It might be hard to see in the video, but this button is in fact active and it has the active class. If I take a look at that, you'll see that we have K-state active being applied to that button. It's slightly indented. So I want to do that for all our buttons. In fact, let's head back here and I'm going to add another function here, which is going to allow us to navigate from page to page. We'll do that a little bit later in this chapter. But for now, I just want to come back to the scripts again and let's take a look at how we can optimize for better performance. We'll look at that next. There are a few ways we can optimize our applications that are based on Telerik UI. Let's talk about the downloaded scripts.
Telerik UI offers a lot of different components and a lot of different functions.
You might not be using all of the functions that are available. And if you're not using all the functions that are available, then why download the entire script bundles? Previously in the layout.cs HTML, we've added the Kendo all.min.js library.
And that gave us the ability to use the buttons and really all the components.
But let's say we wanted to use only the buttons like we're doing now. If I go to the page that's being rendered and I go to the network tab and I refresh, let me do an empty cache and hard reload here. And let's take a look at what's really being downloaded. All right, so here are all the files that are being called. And there's a CSS file. It's not that large. And look at this one. This is the Kendo all.min.js library. And this is 3.2 megabytes. And it's taken 645 milliseconds to download on my local machine. So this is a pretty big file. You don't want to download this whole file if all you're doing is using a button. You can optimize this and not use Kendo all.min.js. This is a good one to use in development, but if you're optimizing for production and for speed, then you want to pick a specific set of files that you're going to be using
and pick only the files that you need for that specific component.
But how do you know which files you're going to need? Well, there's a helpful page for that. If you go to this URL, this particular page gives you the scripts you need just for the button. There's also scripts for layout, scripts for scheduling, scripts for chart, editors,
and other parts of Kendo UI components that you might need.
And they give you exactly the scripts that you need and only the scripts that you need to download. So for the button, we need jQuery. Yes, we already have that on the page. We need that no matter what.
But then we also need Kendo Core.js, Kendo Badge.js, and Kendo Button.js.
So let's head back to our application. And in the layouts page, I'm going to comment Kendo all min for now. And right before the ASP MVC min.js file, I'm going to add the button dependencies. So let's go to scripts, Kendo, and then let's find Kendo button, which is this one. And I believe right before it, we need Kendo core. So there's Kendo core.min.
And if you're using a more recent version of the library, you also need Kendo badge.min.js. And there's one more JS library we need that's actually not listed on the documentation page.
Now, because we're using ASP.NET MVC, we need to include ASP.NET MVC here. But we also need one more library, and that's data, because Kendo ASP.NET MVC JS file relies on this Kendo data layer. So I'm going to also need to add that one. Let's save this and take a look. I'm going to refresh the page, and we don't have any errors. Our buttons still work. And look at this. Here's Kendo core. It's only 55 kilobytes. Kendo button is only 7 kilobytes. Kendo data is 62. And Kendo ASP.NET MVC, it's actually been cached, but it's also pretty small. Let's take a look at that. 17. So this is a far cry from the 3.2 megabytes that we downloaded with Kendo all. So this is one way you can optimize
downloading only what you need for the components that you're using. And if you're using a few of these Kendo components on a single page,
buttons, maybe a drop-down, then you can bundle those together and have them downloaded as one file, which will optimize your downloads even more. If you do want to customize your download, you can go to this tool, available at this URL. A link will be provided down below. Select the version that you like to use, and then scroll down, and under Web, you can check all as well for all the UI components. Or you can select individual components that you want to use. For example, if you select button, you'll just get the button download along with any other dependencies that the button depends on. An example that uses more dependencies is this file manager widget. If I select that, you'll see that a few other dependencies have been selected as well. And then you can go all the way down to click on the download button. Now, if you are using ASP.NET Core, make sure you check this box as well to get the script dependencies for the server-side wrappers.
Now, because we are doing development work here and I want to show off a lot more components in the coming chapters,
I'm going to use Kendo All, but I want you to be aware that once it comes time for production, that's not the one you want to be using. So I'm going to remove core, button, badge, and data, and I'm going to add back Kendo All.min. Let's take a look at another optimization that we can do with bundling of our scripts and CSS in the next lesson. Now, to be consistent with bundling that we're already implementing in our ASP.NET MVC application, we're also going to bundle our Kendo UI assets. We're going to create two bundles, one for our JavaScript and one for our CSS. So if you don't already have it open up bundle config. And first, let's go ahead and create the Kendo JavaScript bundle. We're going to do it right here. Oh, I need to stop the project because we're editing code here. So I'm going to add another bundle right here. I'm just going to copy the Bootstrap one as a reference. And I'm going to call this one Kendo.js. This bundle is going to have two of our Kendo scripts that we are including on this page, Kendo All.min and Kendo ASP MVC.min. So I'm going to copy this one first, and then the ASP MVC one. Now, these files are already minified, so bundling is not really going to help us much here as far as minification, but it is going to create one file instead of two for us to download. So that's one network call instead of two, which is a little bit helpful. Now, I'm going to remove all these script references, and instead I'm going to render a bundle here. So just like we did with rendering Bootstrap, I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to paste our Kendo.js bundle here. Great. Now for the CSS. Let's go down here, and right after the content CSS, I'm going to create the Kendo CSS bundle. Let's just copy this one, paste, and I'm going to call this one Kendo CSS, and this is actually going to use this file right here, which is the default version 2 min.css. And I don't need a second file here, so I'm going to cut that out. Now let's render the style bundle here instead of this link. So I'm going to delete the link, and I'm going to render Kendo CSS bundle right there. And we're done. I'm going to start up our server, and let's take a look. And there we go. We still have the Kendo buttons. Let's just make sure we don't have any errors. I'm going to open up developer tools, and it looks like we're good to go. So that's two ways we can optimize our Kendo UI client-side libraries. Now, if you remember from the previous lesson, I mentioned that if you only want to use the button-related scripts, then you would create a separate bundle just for what you're using and include only that bundle. So in the case of a button, we had 4 scripts that we included. You would bundle the 4 scripts into one bundle and then include that bundle on the page. Let's get back to our button example. We still haven't finished implementing it. In order for us to complete these filter buttons at the top, we need to make sure that when we tap on one of these, it actually navigates us to the proper URL. And we need to go to the dashboard controller, the index action, and pass in the appropriate number of months that we want to filter by. The way we did that with plain HTML is right here on these HTML buttons, we have an onClick event, and we're just directing the browser href. So this is going to redirect the browser. And here we're using another HTML helper to generate a URL to go to with the parameters. So we're going to have user ID, which we don't have yet, but we have months, 3, 6, and 12. So we want to do the same thing with our new Kendo buttons. First, we're going to do this with HTML attributes, and then I'm going to give you an example of how to use Kendo button events. The way we would use HTML attributes in the button is just by adding an onClick attribute. So let's do that. For the 6-month button, we already have HTML attributes here. I'm just going to split this up so we see this a little bit better. 1 attribute per line. Here I'm going to put a comma and create the onClick attribute. So this is going to be a location, href. I'm going to set that equal to something. So we need to generate the new URL. By the way, we need a little single quote here to start off our URL. And I'm going to use the HTML raw helper here. So this gets rendered exactly how I want it, and it doesn't get URL encoded. And now we want to use the URL helper to give us an action. We're going to point to the index action of the dashboard controller. And we want to pass in some route parameters here. So I'm going to open up a new object. First is going to be months. And since this is the button for 6 months, I'm going to pass in this 6 parameter here for months. And user ID. Now, user ID is something we don't have implemented yet, but we will later on in this course when we also filter the dashboard data by users. But for now, I'm going to pass in the viewbag.userid so that we're ready for that moment. All right, after that URL is rendered, I just need to add the closing quote here and a semicolon, and we're done. Let's save this and take a look. I'm going to refresh the page, and let's look at 6 months. Here we go. There's our on-click handler right in line. We have location set to /6 months. That's exactly what we wanted. So it knows automatically that we're currently rendering the dashboard controller and the index action. So it skips that whole process. That's what the URL helper does for us. So all it does is just tack on a slash and the months equals 6 parameter. Now, if we did have users in the URL, I'm just going to add user ID equals, let's say 21. You can see that our button is rendered with months equals 6 and user ID equals 21. Great. We also need the 12-month button. So I'm just going to copy the 6-month button and paste in the 12-month button here. The formatting is a little bit off here. I'm going to call this 12 months. Actually, I'm going to call this 1 year because this is our content. We can call our button whatever we want. And I'm going to give the name of the button to button filter months 12. Remember that button name has to be unique. And then we're going to assign this class of active when viewbag.months equals 12. And I'm going to pass in 12 as the parameter here. So that takes care of our 1 year button. Let's come back to this 3-month button. We're going to implement a different way to handle that click event with events. Another way that we can handle a click on a button is by using its events property. The Kendo button exposes events to us as part of its Fluent API. So I'm going to go up to this filter months 3 button, and I'm going to change this to parentheses so we can split this up to multiple lines. All right, there's content 3 months. I'm going to take off this deferred. We no longer need that. I'm actually going to use some of the HTML attributes here. So I'm going to copy this and paste it here. I want to use the case state active when months equals 3, but I don't want to use the on click. Instead of on click, we're actually going to use events. So I'm going to use events right here, and this will give me a way to configure the events. I'm going to use the Lambda syntax here, which is a very common way that you're going to see us configuring Kendo widgets. This events parameter that's passed in is going to have a few functions on it that we can use, including click. Click is the event that we're going to handle on this button. So it's passed in with events, and this allows me to define a string handler. All I have to do here is just call a JavaScript function. So here I can say on filter item click, and don't forget to put a semicolon here because this is a statement. So now I need to add this on filter item click JavaScript function, and I'm going to do it down at the bottom. So let's head down to the bottom, and in my script section, I'm going to add a script tag, and I'm going to create a function here called on filter item click. And just to make sure it works, let's do an alert. I'm going to save this. Let's head out to our site and refresh it. And I'm going to click on the 3-month button. And there we go. We have the alert pop up with message hello. So that means our function is working. So on click, what I want to do is actually redirect our page to the URL with 3 months as the parameter. So I'm going to say location.href, and I'm going to go to the same URL, months equals 3. All right, let's save this. I'm going to refresh the page and click on 3. And sure enough, we're navigated to months equals 3. So that means we're filtering our issues by 3 months, and our 3-month button is currently active. So this is working just fine. But there's a slight problem here. First of all, I need to add the user ID parameter to our URL. And second of all, what if I wanted to reuse this function for all our buttons? Well, I need to pass in some kind of parameter here. And I want to pass in the months parameter. That way I can convert this to a string literal, and you can use the JavaScript string replacement and pass in months like that. But how do I pass the parameter of the number of months into this function? Well, another way you can use the click handler is not just by specifying the name of the handler, but you can actually provide the function in line here. So I'm going to add function, and then I'm going to actually call our click handler inside that function with the parameter of 3. So if I wanted to use Kendo events on these other buttons, I would just pass in the appropriate number into our on filter item click function. So this will work the same way. Now, what about our user ID parameter? We need to somehow tack that on. Well, the user ID is actually being stored in the view bag in the controller action. So we can get to it that way. inside the scripts here, I need to get a hold of the user ID parameter. So I'm going to create a little server-side script section here. I'm going to create a variable called user ID param. Set that to an empty string for now. And then I'm going to check if it exists on the viewBag. ViewBag user ID. If it's not equal null, then I want to set my user ID param to the string, which is going to tack on the user ID parameter, including the ampersand. So now this user ID param server-side variable is what I need to tack on here to the end of our string. The way I would do that is by using the HTML raw helper. So there's no kind of URL encoding here. And then I'm just going to put in the user ID param in here. Let's test this out. I'm going to click on 6. Our Kendo button gets selected and we have months equals 6 in the URL. I'm going to click on 3, months equals 3. And if I have the user ID here, so now our items are getting filtered, and I can even take a look at the function here in the head. Let's open up script. There's our script, the function that we just wrote on filter item click. It's taken in months and it's changing the location to months equals months and then user ID equals 21. So that's our Kendo buttons. By the way, since we're done with our Kendo buttons, we no longer need the HTML buttons here. So I'm just going to remove them